On the morning of May 2nd, 1972, 173 men climbed into the cage at the Sunshine Mine outside Kellogg, Idaho, and dropped into the earth. Some of them would not see daylight again for 11 days. Some of them would never see it again at all. The Sunshine Mine wasn't just any hole in the ground. It was the richest silver mine in America, 100 miles of tunnels threading through the mountains of the Silver Valley, reaching down more than a mile beneath the surface. Men had worked these shafts for almost a century. Fathers sent their sons down. Brothers worked side by side. In a town like Kellogg, the mine wasn't a job, it was the whole town's bloodstream. That day started like any other. The night shift came up. The day shift went down. Down at the 3,700-foot level, near an old electrical supply area, something began to smolder. Nobody saw a spark. Nobody heard an explosion. It just started, quietly, in a pile of old timber and scrap and trash that had been sitting there for who knows how long. The kind of forgotten junk pile every old mine accumulates in its deepest corners. Around 11:40 that morning, two electricians walked past that area and caught the smell. Smoke. They started shouting, trying to warn anyone nearby. But the men running the operation that day weren't the top officials. It was a Tuesday, and the executives who normally oversaw the mine were topside, 40 miles away in Coeur d'Alene, sitting in a stockholders' meeting. The people left in charge underground had to make a decision they weren't fully prepared to make, and they hesitated. They tried to find the source of the fire instead of pulling the men out immediately. That hesitation cost lives before the day was even half over. The problem with a fire in a mine like Sunshine wasn't really the flames. It was the smoke, and more specifically, it was the carbon monoxide. The fire had broken out on the intake side of the ventilation system, which meant the massive fans built to keep fresh air flowing to 173 men working thousands of feet underground were now doing something else entirely. They were pulling smoke and poison gas through the exact same tunnels the miners breathed in every day. The ventilation system built to keep them alive had become the very thing spreading death through the mine. Carbon monoxide doesn't announce itself. It has no smell, no color, no warning. A man could be breathing it in for minutes, feeling a little foggy, a little tired, and not understand what was happening to his body until his legs stopped working and his thoughts stopped forming clearly. Men working 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet down, in tunnels that stretched for miles, had no idea a fire was even burning until the smoke reached them directly, curling into the drifts and crosscuts where they were setting charges or running the rock drills. At 12:03 that afternoon, more than 20 minutes after the smoke was first noticed, an evacuation order finally went out. But by then, in a mine that size, with men scattered across dozens of levels and tunnels that ran for miles in every direction, getting the order out was one thing. Getting 173 men to the surface was another thing entirely. The only way out, for most of them, was the hoist. Picture something like a steel cage, an elevator car built for hauling ore and men, running on cables through vertical shafts that dropped thousands of feet into the mountain. There were a limited number of these hoists, and they could only carry a handful of men at a time. So as the smoke thickened and the poison gas spread, miners converged on the shaft stations and waited their turn, trusting the men running the machinery topside to bring them up before the air around them became unbreathable. One of those hoist operators kept running his cage up and down, again and again, pulling exhausted, choking men out of the smoke and up toward the surface. He kept working the controls even as the same poisoned air that was killing the miners below started working on him too. He stayed at his post. He got roughly 80 men to safety, and then he collapsed at the controls and died there, having spent the last minutes of his life giving other men more of their own. Above ground, word was spreading through Kellogg fast. Families started gathering near the mine entrance, standing in that particular kind of silence that happens when people are waiting for information they're afraid to receive. By the end of that first day, 24 men were confirmed dead. 58 more were still unaccounted for, somewhere in 100 miles of tunnel, in air that investigators already knew was lethal. Idaho's governor arrived the next day. He stood in front of cameras and told the anxious crowd that everything possible was being done to bring the missing men out. It was true, but it also understated just how difficult that job had become. Rescue teams from mines across Idaho, and eventually from other states and from Canada, converged on Kellogg. Close to 100 trained rescue workers eventually took part in the operation, men who understood exactly what they were walking into and volunteered anyway. The rescue itself became almost a military campaign against the mine's geography. Teams worked in relays, wearing self-contained breathing apparatus, pushing into the smoke-filled levels a little at a time. They used inflatable bags sealed with foam to plug off contaminated sections of tunnel, trying to rebuild a survivable path of air through a mine that had turned into a maze of poison. Every foot they advanced had to be fought for. Every level they cleared had to be checked and rechecked. And at nearly every workstation they passed, they found bodies. Men who had been overcome by the gas before they ever reached an escape route. Men found near tools they'd been using minutes before the smoke arrived. It was slow, grim, methodical work, made harder by the knowledge that speed mattered, that if anyone downstream in those tunnels was somehow still alive, every hour counted against them. By May 5th, 3 days after the fire started, rescue crews had finally managed to seal off enough of the mine's bad air to flood the central shaft area with something breathable. That let them push rescue sorties farther and deeper than before, working toward the number 10 shaft, the hoist that served the deepest active levels of the mine, all the way down past 6,000 feet. It was supposed to become the backbone of the rest of the rescue operation. Instead, when rescuers finally reached it, they found a cave-in had wrecked the power lines and compressed air systems that shaft depended on. Another obstacle in a rescue that had already cost far more time than anyone wanted to admit. By this point, the mine had been sealed off from breathable air for days. Search teams had recovered dozens of bodies. The town's hope, if it hadn't disappeared entirely, had narrowed down to almost nothing. It had been a week. No one survives a week in a carbon monoxide-choked mine without oxygen. Everyone doing the math understood that. And still, the search continued, because there were men still unaccounted for, and their families were still standing at the surface waiting. Then, on May 9th, 7 days after the fire started, rescue crews pushed into one of the deepest sections of the mine, an area near the 4,800-foot level where two miners, Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson, had been working when the smoke first reached them. What the rescue teams found there defied everything anyone expected. Flory and Wilkinson were alive. They had survived an entire week, cut off from the surface, in a mine that had already killed 91 of their co-workers from the very air they were breathing. When the smoke had rolled toward their workstation on the first day, the two men had understood almost immediately that trying to run through it toward the main shaft would kill them before they got anywhere close. So instead of running toward the smoke, they did something that seems almost unthinkable in hindsight. They went further into the mine, away from the fire, into an area they knew had a separate air source, a borehole that fed fresh air down from higher levels. They found a station near that airflow, and they simply stayed there. Day after day, they rationed what little food was around, a few sandwiches someone had left, and they melted ice for water. They stretched a tarp to help hold in warmth, because at that depth the temperature stays high, but the air pressure and moisture play strange tricks on the body over time. They talked, they slept in shifts, they waited, not knowing whether anyone above them even suspected there was air worth finding in that particular corner of the mine. For 7 days they had no real information. They didn't know how many of their friends had died. They didn't know whether the whole mine had been abandoned, whether the fire was still burning somewhere, whether anyone was even looking for them anymore in a section of tunnel that deep. All they had was the fresh air coming through that borehole, and the discipline to stay put instead of trying to gamble their way out through miles of poisoned tunnel. When rescuers finally broke through into that section of the mine and found two men who were tired, hungry, and remarkably, fully alive, it was treated as something close to miraculous. After a week of nothing but recovery work, of pulling body after body out of the dark, the news that two miners had walked out of the Sunshine Mine on their own 2 feet spread through Kellogg and then through the entire country. National news picked up the story. For a brief moment, in the middle of one of the worst mining disasters in American history, there was something to actually celebrate. But the rescue operation didn't end there, and neither did the grief. That same night, after Flory and Wilkinson were brought to the surface, recovery crews found more bodies. The search continued for 4 more days, all the way through May 13th, 11 days after the fire had first started. No other survivors were found. By the time the operation finally concluded, 91 men had died, almost all of them from carbon monoxide poisoning rather than from the fire itself. It remains, to this day, one of the deadliest disasters in the history of American hard rock mining. The scale of the loss is hard to hold in your head all at once. 91 men. In a town the size of Kellogg, that kind of loss doesn't stay contained to individual families. It reshapes the entire community. Investigators later noted that the disaster left more than 200 children without a father. Funeral services ran one after another for days. Some families lost more than one man, a father and a brother, an uncle and a son, all working the same shift in the same mine on the same terrible day. In the aftermath, investigators tried to pin down exactly what had started the fire in the first place. They never found a definitive spark. The most widely accepted theory points to spontaneous combustion inside that old pile of scrap and debris near the electrical shop, the kind of forgotten junk that accumulates in the corners of any operation that's been running for 100 years. But what mattered more than the exact ignition point was everything that had let a small fire become a mass casualty event. The mine had no reliable fire detection system in place. Most of the miners working that day didn't have personal self-rescue breathing devices with them. Communication between the surface and the deep levels of the mine was slow and unreliable, which was part of why the evacuation order took so long to reach everyone. There had been little formal training on what to do in the specific event of an underground fire, as opposed to the more commonly drilled dangers like cave-ins or equipment accidents. None of those individual gaps caused the fire itself, but together, they turned a fire that should have been survivable for most of the men underground into a catastrophe that killed more than half the shift. The disaster forced a national reckoning with mine safety that had been overdue for years. Congress and federal regulators used the Sunshine Mine fire as a central case study in overhauling safety standards across the American mining industry, pushing for better fire detection systems, mandatory self-contained rescue devices for underground workers, improved emergency communication networks, and clearer evacuation protocols that didn't depend on senior executives being present on site to authorize a shutdown. In the years that followed, federal mine safety law changed in ways directly traceable back to what happened in Kellogg that spring. For the survivors, the story didn't end when the cameras left. Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson carried their week underground with them for the rest of their lives, occasionally speaking publicly whenever another mining disaster made headlines somewhere else in the world, always with the particular authority of men who genuinely understood what it meant to wait in the dark for a rescue that might never come. For the families of the 91 who didn't make it out, the disaster became something that never fully closed. Decades later, people in the Silver Valley still describe the loss as something you don't get over, only something you learn to carry. Today, there's a memorial standing near the site in Kellogg, listing the names of the men who died on May 2nd, 1972. It's a quiet monument in a quiet mountain town, but it marks one of the darkest days in the history of American mining and one of its strangest, most improbable moments of survival. Two men who chose to walk deeper into the dark instead of running from it, and lived because of it.